Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to be updating some of our plasticity content. Last year we released some plasticity quick start videos talking about the UI, basic modeling, and how to get working in plasticity. Well, in the last year, a couple of versions have been released. We're on version 1.4 now, and there are a couple of things that changed. Now, the overall work process and the workflow is the same, but some shortcut keys have changed. So it's a good time for us to just refresh that content. What we're going to be doing in this video, which will be kind of long, is we're going to go over the UI and basic shortcuts that you should be familiar with, and then we're going to get into some modeling practice. So if you don't know what plasticity is, definitely check out the website. You can go to the description of this video, download the 30-day trial, and play around with it. So it's going to be a CAD program, but it's CAD for artists. And it's really more of a direct modeler, even though it has a lot of the CAD tools that you come to expect, but it's not a parametric CAD program. What that means is we're not creating a sketch, driving dimensions, and then having those dimensions and sketches linked to the solid objects. It is essentially a non-history based direct modeler. But with that, we get a little bit of freedom. We don't have to worry so much about all those definitions, and we're really free to explore the shapes. Now, if you happen to be purchasing it, there's an indie and a studio license, and there are some differences. You can read that here on the screen, but basically you get a couple of different export and import options with the studio version, but you also get access to the beta program, which means you get to see new features before they're released, and you also get to give feedback on what features should be in the software and how they should work. Now, if you are planning on purchasing it, there is a discount code LEAD10. We are an affiliate, so that'll get you 10% off of a purchase of a studio or indie license, and it also does help out the channel. Now, there's also another link in the description, and this is a user-based unofficial documentation for plasticity, but this is a great list of shortcut keys. Now, these do change from time to time, but most of the things that change are actually contextual shortcuts, which means what happens when you're in the middle of creating a rectangle or a line or something like that. So if you're looking for this reference, go ahead and check out the link in the description. I have no affiliation with this site, but again, it is an unofficial user-created site that does have a lot of great information on it. So back in plasticity, if you've never used it before, we're going to take a quick tour of the user interface. We're not going to cover everything in depth because really I want to get you started in modeling. So first things first, go into your user preferences. Make sure that your navigation preset is set to something that you're familiar with. I'm going to be using Plasticity default. I really like the way that this was set up because the middle mouse is orbit and zoom, and then the right mouse will let you pan, but the right mouse button is also accept when we're creating something. So it's really comfortable, it's really intuitive, and I like to leave it at that. For grids and units, I think that the default settings come in at meters, but I have mine set at millimeters with the grid size set to 100. I don't use grid snapping, so really I just try to minimize the impact of this. You can set it to be whatever you want. You can have accent lines, let's say every 500, grid size is 1,000. But again, play with it. Whatever you want to do there is perfectly fine. It will not have any effect on what we do in this video. And the last setting here is in the general section. Just make sure that checkbox is on. This will allow us to automatically start commands like offset, extrude, and fillet. And for example, if I select this top face, I can begin pulling it out. I can add to it, and I can just make the object bigger. If I select an edge, I can add a chamfer or a fillet pretty easily. I can hold down Control and add additional edges. So it's a great and quick way for us to model. With that said, let's take a quick look at the UI. I'm not going to drive real deep down into everything, but I do want to point out a couple of things and make sure that we are comfortable and understand some shortcuts. So first things first, in the middle of the window is our object, obviously. Solid surface, whatever we're working on. Make sure that you are comfortable with rotating it around, panning, and zooming. That's going to be key. To change our view, we can click on the X, Y, or Z in the upper right-hand corner. These are going to go to some default views. We can also do that with the numpad, which is 1 for front view, Control and 1 for back view, 3 for right, Control and 3 for left, and 7 for top, and Control and 7 for bottom. Now, obviously, if you're working on a Mac, you can replace Control with Command, and you can replace Alt with Option, and those should be the same for you. With that, now it's important that we understand where we can change our selection filters. Now in Plasticity, that's in the upper left-hand corner. And by default, if all of them are turned on, if you want to select an edge to add a fillet, for example, we need to select the object and then select the edge. Now, it's much quicker for us to change our selection filters to only look at edges, and then we can do that without having to select the body first. Now, in addition to that, the numbers across the top of your keyboard will let you pick what these are. And if you hold down the Shift key, you can add to that selection or remove from it. And you can also hit Tab or the number 5 on the keyboard to turn them all on. I think that this is incredibly important, making sure that we're comfortable with going to our different views and make sure that we're comfortable with changing our selection filters on the fly. The rest of the shortcut keys we have are great to know, but honestly, we can find them in other areas. Going back and forth between our selection filters, those are really going to make a big difference. The next thing that we do want to make sure we're comfortable with and understand is the nuanced difference between Shift and Control and Alt when we're modeling. So what I mean by that is if we turn on our edge selection and I just select a single edge and I start to add a fillet, that fillet or chamfer automatically follows the tangency. If we want to add to our selection, we need to hold down the Control key, and that will let us add additional edges to our selection. Now I'm going to hit Escape for a second here. If we want to manually select that entire edge, we need to hold down the Alt key. Now the reason this is important is because some tools like the pipe tool, for example, those are going to require us to have an edge selected before, rather than having it automatically follow tangency like fillets and chamfers do. So once again, Alt will let us select an entire tangent chain of edges. If we want to manually add to our selection, we need to do that holding down the Shift key. To remove from that selection, we hold down the Control key. But if we've already invoked a tool like the fillet or chamfer, then Control temporarily disables our preview and allows us to go in and add additional selections. Those couple of things are really going to make a difference when you start modeling, because you have to know what these Control, Shift, and Alt keys do, because that's going to make a big difference on how you go about selecting edges. A couple of other default things that you should be comfortable with is going to be the options that are in the bottom left-hand corner for move, rotate, and scale. Now, if you're coming from Blender, these are the same shortcut keys, G, S, and R. But for example, if I select this body and I hit G, I can hit X to move in the X direction, or Y to move in Y, or Z to move in Z, or Shift X to move in plane. And we can also hit G a second time to move in screen space. In addition to that, we can use options like Freestyle, which lets us pick a starting point and an ending point. We can also use V to reset where our pivot is going to be. So for example, if we wanted to move out normal to that face, we can do that. And those options are going to be especially important when we start doing things like trying to rotate a face. And you can see here, Plasticity is really good at updating our geometry, but we may want to, let's say, move the pivot point so that we're rotating the face about that side. And that's going to be important that we understand how to do that. And the second point of this is that anytime we have a tool active, the available shortcut keys will be displayed in the bottom right-hand corner. So make sure that you pay close attention to that, because that's going to help you understand which tools you have available. And you don't have to remember everything. The other thing that we should note is the tools in the bottom right are contextual, meaning if I select an entire object or I select a face or an edge, these tools are going to change based on that selection. These are going to be some of the most common tools that you're going to use. And of course, a lot of them have shortcut keys like offset, curve, lets us offset that face. Now, this is much easier to do if you have a face selected and you hit O, because it's going to be based on the center of that face. So if we, for example, select the face and come down here, then we need to worry about where our cursor was at the time we made that selection. But O on the keyboard is certainly a whole lot easier. But that's just a quick way that we can begin modeling and making changes to our design. With that said, a couple of these other tools down here are things like duplicate, the mirror, and a boolean. So boolean will let us add solid bodies together or subtract them from each other. And duplicate has shortcut keys as well. We can do Shift D to duplicate. We also have another option, which is called Control D. So if we do that, we can select a position on one, and we can create a duplicate using that position in orientation. So let's say I can just stack another one up here. And then now we've got these duplicates, and we moved them around based on those pivot points. There is also another option, which is Alt D. Alt and D will allow us to essentially make a silhouette duplicate of that curve. So this is basically the outside shape. And then that curve is now sort of this profile, which we could use to extrude a new version, or we could sweep, or we could do something else with it. So there are a lot of tools inside of Plasticity. A lot of them you can find in these menus. If you can't find them there, using the See All commands or hitting F on the keyboard is a great way to search for the available tools, and you can see what their shortcuts are. So alternative duplicate and duplicate are both here, Shift D and Alt D. Then again, I mentioned Control D is the duplicate with placement, which isn't actually called duplicate. So if we look up copy with placement, you can see here that we've got duplicate and an alternative duplicate, but the place command is Control D. But essentially what it's doing is it's taking whatever object we have selected, and then we can duplicate it by picking its position, and we can hit things like F to flip its orientation, and then we just essentially created a duplicate of it. So I know that's a lot because there is so many shortcut keys, but once you get into the modeling process and you start to figure out how you work, that all is going to start to make sense, because there'll be a handful of shortcut keys that you come up with that are used over and over again. But I believe that the top priority are the numbers for your selection filter, the numbers for your view orientation, and just a handful of things like move, scale, and rotate. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead, start a new file, and let's begin modeling using curves. Now, most of the time, if you're creating something that is not based on these primitives, like a sphere or a cube or a cylinder, what you're going to be doing is creating curves as the basis for your design, whether it's an extrude or a revolve or a sweep or some other version like a loft. So we're going to start by selecting and hitting delete to delete our cube. And then what we want to do is we want to start with curves. Now, there are some nuances here. If you are using the line tool and you just start creating a line, you can go across some of the default axes like X, Y, and Z, and you can snap to geometry, but that's not super helpful, because in the end, we need to have a planar curve, and we need to have a closed profile that we can extrude. So the way that we do this is we're going to start with the default view. Just hit 7 on the keyboard, which will go to our top view. I'm going to begin with a circle, and I'm going to snap to the origin and just draw a circle. Doesn't matter the size. Right click to accept, and then I'm going to go to my corner rectangle. Once I start my corner rectangle, note in the bottom right hand corner, the C key is center corner. So if I hit C on the keyboard, now what I've done is I've created a rectangle that's symmetric about the origin. I can hit tab to go to my dimensions. I'm going to do 8250, tab, and let's call this one 3600, and hit enter twice to accept it. So we've created two different curves. If I rotate this around, you can see that each of these curves are their own inside of our panel over here, but I can select each of them, I can select both of them, and I can begin creating a solid. Before we get to that, I'm going to go back to my top view with 7, and I want to make a couple of notes here, because this is a basic shape. The rectangle is made up of 4 lines that are joined together in a single curve. What that means is that the corner points can be filleted, and we can make adjustments to them. Now, there's a couple ways that we can do this. If I just double click that corner, what this ends up doing is it increases the number of vertices. It essentially is going to turn this into a Bezier curve or a spline. If I double click this one, it does the same thing, and you can see that we've created this smooth transition. If I want to instead fillet this, I can select the points and I can hit B on the keyboard, B like boy. And then what we do is we can drag it inward for our fillet or outward for a chamfer. So these are two methods that allow us to create a basic shape like a rectangle and then quickly manipulate it. There are a couple of other things that we want to note. If I start a new line, so 2 straight line segments, and right click, we have some options down here called subdivide curve, which takes our current curve and it divides it up. And what this means is that we can take this vertex, I can use G on the keyboard, and I can start to manipulate the shape. Now, if we repeat this process and I just do something very similar, and this time I rebuild the curve, you can see the rebuilt curve has a couple of other things going on for it. We've got a refit, which is a tolerance-based refit, and also a number of points. When we do this, it highlights the fact that the center of this is now smooth. So when we take a look at this curve, we can take this internal point and we can start to move it around. And this is a nice way that we can start to build pretty simplified versions of a design. And then we can use this refit option with a number of points and turn it into a nice smooth curve. So I like to use this method when I'm laying out a complex shape and I don't necessarily want to go in and create a control point spline and work my way like this. So basically what I do is I use the straight lines and I start to build out just essentially that control frame. I reposition the vertices and then I use the rebuild option with a number of points, and that helps me get a little bit closer and simplifying that process, because sometimes using straight lines is just a little bit easier. Either option is perfectly fine, but for the most part, you can play around with those and see that there are a lot of different ways that we can do this, from double clicking a corner point to adding a fillet with B on the keyboard to refitting or subdividing a curve. Now that we've got these two profiles, all we really need to do is select a profile and begin pulling it up in 3D. After we've done this, I don't need these curves anymore, so I can hide them or delete them. I'm going to delete them in this case just to keep everything nice and clean over here. After we're done with this, we're going to move into what's called direct modeling. So instead of adding additional curves, which we will still do, what we're going to do is manipulate the geometry directly. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the top face, and then we're going to rotate it. You can use R on the keyboard, and we want to reset our pivot point, which is V. So V, we'll put our pivot point back here, and then about the Z axis, we're just going to taper this down. So now we've taken our basic shape and we've added an angle to that top face. There are a couple ways that we can do this, but rotating it is arguably the simplest and quickest way. Now that we have this, I want to add some additional geometry here. So I'm going to select this face and I want to create a plane from selection. Now you can do this with the space bar, or you can click here. I'm going to use space bar, and then I want to begin adding a line. So I'm going to come here. And notice that because we're not on the default plane, we're on a temporary construction plane that's based on a face, we don't have XY snaps. So there's a couple things that we can do. We can come back to this last line, hover over it, and tap the Shift key. Well, as soon as we do that, this is going to enable a couple of snaps. You can see now we've got a perpendicular snap. I'm going to snap here. This automatically defaults to parallel, but I want it to end at this point, so I'm going to tap Shift, and this gives me my extension and allows me to come back and create that closed profile. I'm going to hit X to end that construction plane. Then I'm going to take this and begin pulling it down. I want to remove it from the solid body, so I need to use W, which is the difference, and then I need to select the body I want to remove it from, right-click, and say OK. I'm going to delete that curve because I don't need it. Now, if we decided that we actually want this to go all the way through, all we have to do is select the face and just pull it down through the body, and now it's moved all the way through. Next thing I want to do is add some fillets to these corners, so I'm going to change my selection filter to Edge. I'm going to hold down Shift to add to my selection, and then begin dragging this inward to add our fillets. We'll right-click to accept, and then I'm going to select this upper edge and this one, and begin adding a chamfer. Now, you'll notice when I do this that these two chamfers overlap. Now, if I wanted to move the position of that opening, in a traditional CAD program, what we need to do is go back to our sketch and we would need to modify dimensions. But we're going to be direct modeling, which means that we're just going to move it directly. So I'm going to change my selection up here to face. I'm going to grab this face and just begin pulling it. Now, notice the fillets go with it, but as soon as the fillets start to overlap, then we have a sharp point here. So if you want to move this to a position where the fillets create a true slot, then what we want to do is we want to use the move command. So again, G on the keyboard. As we begin moving this, notice the fillets still go with it. But now what we're going to do is use freestyle, which is F on the keyboard, and we'll simply move from this point to this point and right click and say OK. Now, plasticity is really good about this type of thing. You can see that it healed those two fillets, and now it's a single arc. So it cleaned up the geometry for us at the same time. I'm going to go back to my edge selection, which is 2 on our numbers, and I'm going to just grab these upper and lower edges and begin adding a chamfer. I'm going to right click. I'm going to grab this upper edge, shift select this lower edge, and I'm going to add a fillet around that and right click and say OK. Now, the next thing I want to do is I decided I wanted to add some more geometry here. So back to my all selection, I'm going to hit spacebar to create a new construction plane. And I'm going to add a circle that's snapped about the y-axis. Right click. And I'm going to get off my construction plane and begin pulling this up. Now, before we did the removal of geometry, this time we're going to do a union or join them together. So we're going to hit Q on the keyboard, which is going to default to this target bodies. We'll select this, right click, and make sure that we have a single body. And then I'm going to delete that curve. If we don't have a single body, when we try to do something like fillet that edge, you'll notice that it rounds itself under instead of over. Now, a lot of times when we're modeling, adding a construction plane, then adding a curve is not the most efficient way. So there's a couple other ways that we can use these direct modeling tools. For example, we can select this top face, we can hit O for offset, begin offsetting that inward, right click to accept, and then pull this down through the model. You can see now we've created a hole all the way through, and then we can add things like chamfers to these upper edges as we need. Go ahead and pull that in, add a chamfer. Another thing that we can do is we can divide faces up with a couple of different tools. So first of which is we can cut or imprint a solid body with a curve. Now that's one way that we can do it. Simply go to something like a side view, and we could draw a line, and then we could use that imprint option. But there are a couple of other ways that are a little bit more efficient. One is called the ISO Param. So if I select a face and I hit F and I start to type in ISO Param, we can see that this is Control R. Now, again, if you're coming from Blender, this Control R should be familiar to you. This allows us to divide faces up, and I'm going to hit Tab. I'm going to hold down Shift and start to roll the mouse wheel. And now I've added those divisions, which means I can quickly and easily pull this section out. So that's one way in which we can divide things up. Another way that we can do this is with the line tool or curve tools, there's a knife option. So if I hit K on the keyboard, what I can do is draw a line, right click, and what I've done is I've used it as a knife tool rather than creating a curve. I've simply split or divided that face up. We still have a single solid body, but now we've been able to divide that up. The next thing that I want to do is create a cut going through the side. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. Now, one way is for us to take the profile of the side face and project it and sort of project it to that center section, offset it, and then we can use it to create that cut. We could also do this directly by hitting O and creating an offset of that face, or we can start to create new curves. Now, one of the benefits here is that we can hit Shift and we can create a parallel relation. So for example, I can start to create a parallel here. I can come up vertically, and then I can tap here and I can create the extension or intersection of those. Right click to say OK. And then if I take this endpoint, I can say G, and I can move this using my freestyle method going from and to. Let's go ahead and do that again. G, let me zoom in so we can see it. F, we're going to start here and go there, right click, and now we've created our closed profile. So using those extensions by tapping Shift and getting those extensions or parallel or perpendicular relationships can be a quick way for you to create something like this rather than doing some sort of projection or offset from those faces. So now that we have this, what we're going to do is take this and extrude it all the way through, using W for difference and allowing it to cut through that body, and then deleting this curve. We're going to change to our edge selection, which is 2 on our numbers. We're going to hold down Shift, and we want to begin creating a fillet here. And once we have that fillet, we're going to hold down Control, which will allow us to add the additional edges. If you need to rotate, go ahead and do that. And then we'll right click to accept that. Now that we've got this, we'll go to the outside edge and we'll add a chamfer, rotate it around, hold down Control, add a chamfer there. And you can see that we've now added that extra little detail. It cuts through both of those openings. And we did it relatively quick and simple by sketching from the side view and then just using some extensions or snaps to allow us to create something that was both parallel to the side faces and vertical or perpendicular to our ground plane. So those tools that we used and the general process for modeling is going to be pretty common across the board. Now, obviously, there are a dozen or more common tools that are used for traditional modeling, and there's an entire list of tools that we didn't even get to cover. So when we're dealing with things like curves and splines, we cover that a lot in our concept car modeling series. So if you're looking for content on how to create complex surfaces, I do suggest that you check that video out. There are also plenty of other tools that we didn't get to in this video, things like using imprint or doing some additional duplication options. But for the most part, the common tools that we use in the common modeling approach of creating a basic shape, using some direct modeling tools to do things like rotate face, and then some of the other tools like Param or the knife tool and creating those additional details. That's going to be a pretty common way that you can use plasticity as a modeler. Now, if you have any questions on this or if anything didn't work quite right for you, please leave a comment and let me know. I do plan on doing more plasticity content, but I did want to re-release a sort of getting started video so that way people can get comfortable with the program before moving on to more complex models. So as always, thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.